17 years ago. The newborn cried out. The light hurt his eyes. He was born in a village so small, a name would have been wasted on it. To the rest of the world, it was little more than an accidental assortment of huts in the foothills, and its only wealth was in the small flocks of sheep drifting from hill to hill above meager fields barely more than gardens. The village was a theoretical piece of a distant lord's holdings, tick marks on an occasional census, a single lamb collected as back taxes. It was in the empty space between places on the map, isolated except for occasional traders passing between the mountains to the north and river to the east, picking up leather and fleeces in exchange for metal tools and strong ales. And it was mundane except for even more occasional priests, wizards, or scholars seeking the Thessalonian ruins higher in the hills. And it was peaceful except for the raids. Whispered stories told of nights when dark elf princelings boiled up from under the mountain with squads of goblins, tormenting isolated human settlements as part of a twisted rite of passage. Sometimes traders who had sampled too much of their own barrels would mutter about human lords paying blood money to the underlords, gold and goods, with an unwritten agreement to overlook the occasional raids in exchange for overall peace. The fancy lords keep their armies close to home while the demons under the mountain herd us like sheep, drunk old men grumbled. Give them what they want, they'll go away. Let you live another day, to come again and take more away. The newborn cried out. The light hurt his blood-red eyes. Those eyes, slightly dark skin, pointed ears. The raiders had taken more than sheep from his mother. She held him close and shaded his eyes from the light as tears fell from hers. 12 years ago. Sil woke to smoke and screams. A naturally quiet child, he didn't cry out. He just opened his eyes and looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. His mother was up and dressed, panic on her face. She knelt down to his makeshift bed of fleece and held him close. I have to go outside, Sil. You have to stay inside. Bar the door. Don't come out. Don't let anyone in, no matter what. Hide and be silent. She pulled him with her to the door and hugged him again, hard. Be brave, Sileadh. I love you. After he'd stood on his toes and barred the door, Sil pulled his fleece into the shadows under the small table, the one little hiding spot in the hut, and buried himself in it. Outside, he heard the muffled screams of men and women in pain and the bleats of lambs in terror. He heard small, gravelly voices shouting harsh words in a language he didn't understand, and then silence. And then at the door, a loud thump, then another, and finally a terrible splintering crack as the bar broke and the door slammed open. Outlined in a red glow of fire was an elf, a cruel curved sword held ready in one hand. In front of him, a goblin with a torch was lowering a heavy metal boot and smirking a terrible, toothy grin. The elf had dark skin, white hair, and blood-red eyes like Sil's. He put a hand on the goblin's shoulder and stilled him, scanning the room, his expression absolutely calm. His eyes settled on Sil's hiding place, and Sil knew he was found. Sil stood up, one hand still clutching the fleece trailing behind him. He quietly stared at the dark elf, at a face not so unlike his own, but without a hint of emotion. He was so terrified that neither tears nor screams would come. "Are you my daddy?" he asked. Now tears came, welling up in his eyes and clouding his sight. "Are you here to take me back under the mountain?" The elf's dark face broke into a smile, and he laughed. He let his sword drop lazily, seemingly forgotten as spasms of laughter took him, completely unrestrained. "Oh, gods below, no, little half-breed," he said in perfect common tongue. "No to both. I can't imagine who the degenerate youth was that lay with an animal and produced you, although I'd love to know so that I could laugh at him in person later. And I certainly will not take you back into the Underdark, because half-breeds like you, in my experience, do not even make useful slaves. No, sad small thing, this is but an amusing coincidence. Your careless lord failed to meet an obligation, and so there must be a reckoning in his lands, nothing more. Now, die alone and fatherless." He chuckled one more time and turned, left hand upraised. "Burn it with the rest," he said. The goblin beside him cackled and tossed the torch into the home between Sil and the door, then followed it with a splash of something from a flask. Sil drew back and pressed himself against the far wall as flames leapt up from floor to ceiling. Smoke filled the air. Sil was sobbing now, panicking. The smoke rising stung his eyes, and it was quickly becoming hard to breathe. His face started to feel raw from the rising heat. He looked from side to side. Could he get through the massive flames to one of the small windows? To the door? Knowing he had no other choice, Sil prepared to jump into the flames and tried to escape, when there was another enormous crack of wood splintering behind him. He froze, stunned by a deafening crash, much louder even than when the door had been broken open. Timbers from the wall flew past him. Before Sil could turn, before he could even scream, 2 huge clawed hands that smelled of metal and lightning reached out and wrapped him up. One hand covered his eyes and mouth. The other pulled him by his chest against something very hard and cool compared to the fire in front of him. The deepest, richest voice Sil had ever heard intoned near his ear. "There is much for you to do yet on this plane, little one. Do not leap into the flame." Sil's screams of terror were muffled by one enormous hand as he was lifted high up into the air. Darkness took him as he fell mercifully unconscious. Sil woke lying face down on the ground in the hills above his village. He pushed his tiny body up on hands and knees, shaking and filthy, and looked down at his home. The entire village was smoldering now, all red embers and smoke. The hills were silent. He wanted to cry more, but there didn't seem to be any tears left in him. He sat back, staring at the distant glow, and gradually realized that something very large was behind him. Sil slowly, dreading what he might see, stood, turned, and looked. With eyes unhindered by darkness, the one gift from his unknown father, he saw his rescuer. It was hunched down, watching him, bigger than any animal he'd ever seen. He could see great wings were tucked down along its back, 4 legs under its body, and 2 arms crossed in front of its chest. It looked like a kind of great lizard assembled from intricate metal parts, gold and brass. And as he stared, tiny sparks of blue energy flickered in and out of existence deep between tiny gaps between metallic scales and bands. His gaze traveled slowly up a long serpentine neck until it came to rest on an enormous saurian head, much bigger than that of a draft horse, with spikes, 2 horns, and 2 sparkling blue eyes, all blue, with no whites at all, more gems than eyes. "Don't be afraid," it said. She, he thought. He was sure of it somehow. She, not it. "Don't be afraid," she said again, surprisingly gently for something so huge. "I am not from under the mountain." Sil just stared, transfixed and in shock. "I'm not scared," he said, and found that he wasn't. "You're very pretty," he said, transfixed on the flickers of blue energy he could just barely see through gaps between the scales and spikes of the head. It shouldn't have been possible for that face to show an expression of surprised embarrassment, but somehow the creature managed it. "Thank you," she said, after a long, obviously baffled pause. "What's your name?" he asked. "Thank you for saving me from the goblins. Will you be my friend?" "You are resilient, little one, and you are welcome. And I do want to be your friend. I've come a very, very long way for that. My name is unfortunately beyond your ability to pronounce. If you are willing to give me a name to use within your plane of existence, I would consider that to be a gift of value." Sil thought for a moment, and then, inspired, he said, "Werk. I'll call you Werk." The creature seemed to consider the name carefully. "Werk. That's appropriate. It is actually surprisingly close to the 17th syllable of my true name, which is particularly dear to me. Thank you for giving me this name. I shall use it to keep me tethered to this world for a time." Then, very formally, she bowed her great head and said, "I consider the gift of this name payment for saving you, and our scales are now balanced." The wonder of being rescued by Werk wearing off, suddenly the memories of the past few hours all came flooding back to Sil. The tears came flooding back as well, and out. He fell to his knees, put his arms as far around the great draconian body as he could, which wasn't very far, and sobbed. As his tears dripped down the vast, scaly chest, they glowed slightly blue, somehow affected by the strange energies within. Werk hesitantly put her arms up and around the crying child. "Why are you crying, little one? Our scales are balanced. That is a joyful thing." Sil, sobbing almost too hard to answer, managed to choke out, "My mom. I want my mom." Werk sighed, an enormous, cavernous sound. "Already I feel your world and your name gift pulling at me, as it must. I forget sometimes about loss and sadness and the illusion of the temporary. She and everyone else in your village continues on, always, yet have fled this plane, little one. There are rules, and I could not keep her here, nor can I bring her back. I was permitted only to retrieve you, with a bargain in arrears, which you have fulfilled with a name. This is as it must be, as are all things." Werk gently, and somewhat awkwardly, patted Sil on the head with one enormous clawed hand and then pulled him from her chest. The glowing tears left little trails of soft light. "Time for tears later, little one. We must bargain first. Can you do this?" Not entirely understanding, but feeling empty and distant, Sil nodded silently. "Little one, tell me your name so that I may hear it come from your lips." "Sil?" he replied hesitantly. Werk raised one scaly ridge above an eye, a gesture that looked so odd on her face that Sil actually found himself giggling nervously. "Is that your proper name?" she asked. "Just Sil?" Sil shook his head. "No," he said. "Sileadh. My real name is Sileadh. Werk nodded approvingly. Sileadh, she said, as if rolling around his name on her tongue and tasting it. Sileadh, our scales are balanced. As I've said, I gifted you with escape from the flames and escape from those from under the mountain. You gifted me with a name that is of this plane, which has already allowed me to bind myself to it for a time. The rest of the world seemed to go still as Werk became very formal again. Sileadh, I propose now that we bring our scales back out of balance. I cannot bring your mother back, nor replace her, nor any of the village that sustained you. But I can fulfill some of what their duties would have been, in some ways more than they would have, in others less. I propose that I will carry you now to the ruins high up in these hills. There I will help you make camp. I will protect you and teach you what I can for 3 threes of years. That is as long as the name you have given me alone can allow me to remain bound to your world. Once that time is complete, you will be in my debt. And when you can, you will return what I have given in equal measure. You will seek the power to summon me back to this plane, and you will do everything you can for 3 threes of years after you gain that power to strengthen me. There will be much work for us to do, and I will teach you the meaning of that over time. This I, now called Werk, propose to you, Sileadh. Do we have a bargain? Soft rain began. Sil turned and watched it fall on the charred remains of his village. Plumes of steam were rising in the light of pre-dawn. He was alone except for this creature, and quickly feeling lonely, cold, and afraid. Yes, he said. Slowly, the rain washed away his tears. 3 years ago. Werk made good on her side of the bargain. For 9 years she raised Sil, as much as such an alien being could raise a young boy. She first hid him away in the ruins high up in the hills, and like a mother bird she brought him what was needed for shelter and for food. Then she taught him how to stay hidden in a dangerous world. She taught him how to speak and read ancient languages, of the ruins, of the elves, of other beings like her. At night she sheltered him beneath a great wing, taught him whispers of magic, and lulled him to sleep with stories of other realms and fantastic places that he could hardly believe, worlds of single elements, forges in the hearts of stars, kingdoms of pure order and writhing realms of pure chaos. And she told him of an ancient, universal force of law that she served. Perhaps, she confided in him once, a force that she was created to serve. A force that one day he would benefit as well through the very nature of his existence when their bargain was fulfilled. Hidden away in the hills like a phantom haunting the highland ruins, Sil learned to fight. Werk would track down prey, and he would spring out and take it down with whatever means he had. Bare hands, sharpened sticks, an ancient flint knife, and eventually a sturdy crossbow traded from a lost peddler for a wolf pelt and directions down to the high road. Gradually, he began to seek out other humans and dwarfish caravans on his own. He'd trade furs from his kills and trinkets from the ruins for useful things. Real clothing and a sturdy set of leathers, the luxury of fresh fruits and vegetables that weren't foraged by Werk, and sometimes even a loaf of bread. And most treasured, a set of smoked glass goggles that kept his eyes slightly more comfortable in the painful daylight and kept the dwarfish merchants from staring so pointedly. The dwarfs had an inkling of where he'd come from, passing the burnt husk of the village as they did. They called him Sileadh from Embers. In their thick mountain-accented common it sounded like Sileadh Fae Ember. And Sil began to use that as his full name, leading humans who knew no better to assume his family had come from some faraway place called Ember. Always Sil returned to the ruins and to Werk. And then, far too fast, the 9 years were over. Now a gangly youth just shy of 15 years, with the dark hair of his mother but a hint of his anonymous father's dark skin, pointed ears, and of course red eyes, Sil stood before Werk as she posed in what he'd long ago come to think of as her most formal stance. We have come to the end of my half of our bargain, Sileadh. Our scales are now far out of balance. I think you must agree. Sil nodded solemnly, and then smiled. Of course, Werk. I can't deny it, and I wouldn't deny it. You've saved my life and taught me so many things. I owe everything to you, and I'm not ashamed to say that. You have given me everything you promised and more. What should I do to begin repaying you? Werk's reptilian face dropped into an expression of profound sadness. Sileadh, I think you forget, perhaps, the full terms of our bargain, the rules that I absolutely must abide by. That may be my fault, and therefore does not further tilt our scales in any direction. I have not reminded you of it as constantly as I should have. Sil's brow wrinkled, confused. What do you mean, Werk? I will do anything you ask, you know that. I owe you my life, and I will repay you with the rest of my life if need be. I will balance our scales. Werk sighed her cavernous sigh. I mean that it is now time for me to leave this plane. We have reached the end of the power of the name gift. That is something I must respect and depart." Sil stared for a long moment, uncomprehending, and then his face fell too as he realized what she meant. "You mean—" "Yes. By tomorrow morning, when you wake, I will be gone from this plane, and I cannot return until you gain the power to bring me back yourself. Even then I will be so small, so weak, a shadow of what I am today. Only then can you begin to fulfill your portion of our bargain. It will be your task to strengthen my tether to this world, to you, and therefore strengthen me for 3 threes of years following that, just as I strengthened you for these years past." "If you will go in my sleep, then I will not sleep." Sileadh, that is our bargain. Those are the rules. We must respect them." Sil took a deep breath and calmed himself as she taught him long ago, back when flashbacks of that terrible night still haunted him. He closed his eyes, cleared his mind, focused on the world around him and inside him, and then, eyes still closed, nodded. "Of course, Werk. I'm sorry to have forgotten. I know that we must always follow the universal law. If this is part of that law, I commit myself to it absolutely, as you have taught me. I am ashamed for my weakness, and I will be better." Werk smiled. "Good, little one, good. I am proud, and I know you will make me more proud yet. Do not be ashamed, for your feelings are strength, not weakness, so long as you are also able to control your actions. I too would gladly stay here longer, and I too look forward to the day we will be together again, and we will therefore make sure that day comes soon. What should I do? Here at the end of your childhood, I will carry you one last time, all the way to the trail by the river to the east. There you will make camp, and you will sleep. When you wake, I will be gone. You will follow the river trail to the south, until you reach the great city at its end. There you will find those that can teach you what you need to know. I came for many reasons, but most of all because you have that power within you to be awakened. You need only learn the proper rituals and focus, and we will be together again, this time for as long as you live." Sil nodded. "I will do this." Then he lunged forward and wrapped his arms around Werk's neck, his arms now long enough to reach around. His eyes glowed softly blue on her skin, as they always did, lit from within by her strange energies. "I will miss you so much." Her formality broken now by Sil's ridiculous display of affection. Werk chuckled softly and held her huge arms around him in return, less awkwardly now than years ago. "Fear not, little one. Fulfill your role, and you will not miss me for long. I will return. This is as it must be, as are all things. Now gather anything you can carry that may be useful or that you can trade. The journey down the river will not be arduous, but it is not a short one, and you will not have me to track prey for you now. At least, not for a little while." 1 month ago. Sil stumbled, leaning against a building at the mouth of an alley, and vomited. Things had not gone well. Over 2 years ago, he'd made that journey along the river with boundless optimism. Werk had confidence in him. Werk had flown across the many planes from far, far outside because she sensed in him whatever was needed to call her back later. If she had all that confidence in him, so must he. But things had gone awry almost the moment he entered the city gates. This place ate strangers alive. First, within minutes, his pocket had been slit, his few coins gone. Then he rapidly discovered that public houses and residents offered no hospitality to strangers without money, giving nothing but cold looks, and in one case, a firmly planted boot. Worst of all, he found that without a penny to his name, covered in dust and mud and bruises, and with recognizably dark elven features, the school of spellcraft in the city wouldn't even let him on its grounds. The gate porters, who were just muscle-bound thugs, not wizards at all, laughed at his story. "Oh, raised by a magical space dragon who saved you from scary monsters, eh?" they leered. "Tell that one down at the pub and it might get you a drink, but it ain't getting you in here. Piss off, you red-eye scum." He found himself drifting through an underworld he didn't understand and couldn't adapt to, struggling to survive. And eventually, in desperation and pain and stupidity, he got hooked. Shiver, they called it, because it gave you shivering fever dreams while you were awake. It was the drug of choice for the lowest of the low. And here he was, below them all, puking and stumbling into an alley. "I'm dying," he thought to himself. "Tonight I'm dying for sure, and I'll never see Werk again." Tears ran down his face, ordinary tears with no glow at all. The lack of glow made him sob harder. If only the shiver hallucinations would at least make them glow. I've failed completely. At least in the gloom of the alley, his eyes didn't hurt. He pushed his goggles atop of his head and stared down at his hands, which seemed to be in several places at once, there and not there. Fever dreams. Shiver dreams. No, tainted shiver dreams. Hallucinations from badly cooked shiver, with too much of the pure venom in it. Deadly shiver. He fell to his knees crying, absently wiping bloody vomit from his mouth with their not their hands. He was so far gone that he didn't notice two shadows detach from the wall and creep into the alley behind him, all but invisible except for glints of sharp steel. As the thugs padded into the alley, Sil continued to stare at his hands. He felt his body dying from the tainted shiver, but it was somehow far away. It didn't even hurt, except as a distant distraction. But his hands seemed terribly important. His there, not there hands. Experimentally, he moved them into different positions, and the patterns of unreality shifted. It was like he was seeing many worlds at once, all jumbled on top of each other, and in each of them his hands were in a slightly different place. In his shiver-addled brain, somehow the pattern became clear, a strangely ordered whole. A pattern of movement and rhythm flowed through him and into his hands. Still kneeling, he waved and gestured, bowed and tilted, his hands moving in an intricate dance to music that only he could hear. At the mouth of the alley, one thug said to another, "Looks like this one's already dying. See, so far gone he can't even hear us. What do we do? Do we wait?" The other one shrugged. "Nah, just slit his throat and roll him. We have better shit to do tonight than wait for some gutter trash to kick it. I'll watch the street." Unhearing, uncaring, Sil continued his hand dance. It felt like he'd been weaving these patterns all of his life, but how long had it actually been? A half minute? A minute? It was impossible to comprehend time, seeing all the layered worlds on top of one another. All that mattered was the beautiful, beautiful pattern. The perfect order. The first thug took a few steps toward him, knife glinting and ready, and hesitated. "Man, you know I hate the crazies." The second thug sighed and walked up briskly, raising up his blade. "Fine then, I'll do it, you pissing wimp." And suddenly Sil laughed. It was a totally incongruent expression of pure childlike joy from the dying young man. "Not so small, not so weak," he mumbled, staring forward away from the men into the black shadows of the alley. He raised his arms up, reaching out, and from the depths of those shadows, something exploded outward. The last thing the first thug saw was a horror of glinting golden metal and blue sparks and teeth and claws. The second thug, the one closer to Sil, didn't have time to see anything at all. Sil vomited again, turned, and crawled toward the softly glowing Werk. "I'm sorry, Werk. I failed. You had to rescue me again. I tried so hard, but without you, I failed at everything." Werk turned. She was neither small nor weak the way she'd said she'd be years ago, but she was much smaller than he remembered, and her shape was different, lacking wings or arms. Inanely, he thought to himself, is she to herself now like a tadpole is to a frog? Without arms to hold him, the proto-Werk nuzzled her scaly metal cheek gently across his stained face. He heard her voice inside his head, the most welcome sound of his life. "You have not failed me, little one. In fact, you have nearly killed yourself tonight seeking the path to me, and found it regardless. This is as it must be, as are all things. We have much, much to do now. Scales to balance, not just ours, but many. First, though, you must rest. It has been a hard night for you. Hard years, I think." Sil held on to Werk and cried tears of joy. As they flowed down her golden brass body, this time they glowed. 1 week ago. Ratbutt groggily came back to consciousness and discovered that he couldn't move, his head hurt, and something was covering his eyes. Memories slowly came back to him. "Gods damn it," he thought. "Some damn shiver-addled solly knocked me out." He thrashed about experimentally. "And tied me up." "Ah, you're awake," said a cheerful voice. "That's good. I was concerned you might be injured. I'm going to take off the blindfold now so we can talk, as long as you can be polite." The blindfold came off, and he found himself in a dimly lit room, some part of an obviously abandoned tenement. He was tied to a chair, and in front of him was an elf with a friendly smile and smoldering, blood-red eyes. Not an elf, he corrected himself. It's that stinking half-breed, that shiverhead that disappeared a couple weeks ago when we had that bad batch. "Listen to me, you little half-breed solly piss. When I get my hands on you, Ooh!" Swiftly, the half-elf jammed the blindfold into Ratbutt's mouth and held it there, hard. "Oh, that's enough of that," said the half-elf. "Especially from a boy of what, perhaps 13 tender years? I want to have a reasonable conversation with you, but obviously you're not ready. Allow me to explain a few things while you calm down." Panicking and almost choking, Ratbutt made frantic muffled sounds and noticed that something about the half-elf seemed different. He seemed larger somehow, or maybe just unnatural. More unnatural than he already looked with those bloody eyes. Slowly he stopped trying to talk and focused on not gagging. Good, that's better. You see, you may or may not remember me, but a few weeks ago you sold me some very bad shiver. I realize that your first assumption may be that I'm going to murder you for that, but actually I'd prefer not to kill you, and in fact, I'm about to thank you. The half-elf inclined his head slightly, a pair of weird goggles hanging around his neck bobbing down and then up in front of Ratbutt's face. Thank you, he said. You've unwittingly helped me pass a difficult moment in my life, and also given me an immediate purpose. Now I'd like to remove this from your mouth and ask you some questions, and I'd like you to answer them in a civilized manner. You may decline to answer if you must, but you may not be rude or insulting again. Is that clear? This guy's pissing crazy, thought Ratbutt. He'd seen it happen sometimes, when someone survived a really bad shiver trip. The body never quite recovered, and the mind, who could say? Best to play along. He nodded slowly. The gag came out of his mouth, and he coughed and took deep breaths. He looked up at the half-elf warily. My first question is probably the one you're expecting. Did you know the shiver you sold me was tainted? Ratbutt emphatically shook his head, and the half-elf remained smiling but raised a single eyebrow. Are you sure about that? I told you I have no intent to take some kind of terrible revenge upon you for nearly killing me, but I would hate to think you'd lie to me, Ratbutt, you pathetic maggot. The last was delivered without the slightest diminishing of his smile or change in his tone of voice. Ratbutt found himself deeply unnerved and decided, suddenly, that honesty was a very, very good idea. Maybe he'd get out of this alive. Look, I knew it wasn't the best quality, okay? Ratbutt licked his lips nervously. But I didn't know it was poison. I don't want to lose customers, right? I mostly just sell what I get handed. I ain't an alchemist to check it for purity, right? The half-elf sighed. I believe you, Ratbutt. Say, Ratbutt, if you don't mind me asking you a personal question also, do you have a family? Ratbutt was profoundly uncomfortable, torn between saving face and his fear of lying to this crazed, bloody-eyed madman. No, well, look, not really. I have an old man, right? But he's a right solly bastard, isn't he? That's how I fell in the crew I'm with now, better than dodging his fists. Why did I say that, he wondered. How did this guy rattle me that bad? The half-elf looked genuinely sad. I'm sorry to hear that, Ratbutt. You see, I lost my family a long time ago. As you'd imagine, I never knew my father. My mother died. I was raised by somebody else, though, who has been very, very good to me. It sounds like you weren't lucky enough to have that. It's unfortunate, because your poor upbringing is going to get you killed if you can't overcome it. The half-elf suddenly was on one knee with his face right in Ratbutt's face. A pair of huge red eyes filled up his whole world. You get that, don't you, Ratbutt? Ratbutt nodded his head carefully. Anything to get those eyes away. So let's make a bargain, Ratbutt. I will, for my part of the bargain, ask you one more question, and then I will not do anything else. I will not, for example, leave you tied up in here to be eaten by rats, which would be a terrible and slow death, or drag you in front of any of our magistrates with shiver to be found in your pockets, which would be a terrible and quick one. I will, quite simply, leave you in peace with no malice, even though you nearly killed me. And all you have to do for your part of the bargain, to balance our scales, is to answer one last question truthfully and completely, leave your current employer and profession immediately and permanently, and never cross my path again. The half-elf stood back up. What say you, Ratbutt? Do we have a bargain? Back when the half-elf had said the thing about being left to be eaten by rats, Ratbutt could swear he heard something moving around behind him, claws clicking against decrepit floorboards. He nodded emphatically. Yes, it's a deal. The half-elf was back to being all smiles. Excellent, Ratbutt. I'm glad to hear that. So now to the question. He leaned forward again, not quite face to face this time, but with interest. Ratbutt's eyes widened as behind the elf he saw a metallic lizard thing, roughly the size of a large wolf or a small pony, sinuously stalk into view. Its claws made the clicking noise. Tell me, Ratbutt, who do you work for? Tell me all about them. This has been the character history for Sileadh Fae Ember. All text and narration by Sileadh. Some world elements copyright Paizo.